Okie dokie. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jake. I'm going to be leading you through a brief workshop on folio technique and acting Shakespeare. We're going to be working off of this little slideshow. I'm down here in the corner, at least I think, if I'm doing everything correctly, but you don't need to see my ugly old mug. Let's jump right on in. So, what I'm going to cover in this workshop, this is a pretty base level kind of look at Shakespeare. I'm not going to get too in depth. There's a lot more we could go into. This is just to make you comfortable with Shakespeare, to get you to a place where you aren't as intimidated, I guess is the way I'll put it. So what we're going to cover, we're going to talk about who Shakespeare was. I mean, you need to know a little bit about the man before you can dive into his works. We're going to talk about what the first folio is. That's where folio technique is based in. We are going to talk about folio technique and what that is. In that section, we're going to talk about prose versus verse, iambic pentameter, couplets, punctuation and why it's important, Shakespeare's clues for his actors, and then we're going to talk about some other considerations that aren't necessarily folio technique, but are very helpful for actors that are approaching Shakespeare. So we're going to talk about word choice, we're going to talk about historical context, and then I'm going to give you some resources that will just help you in your preparation a bit more. Let's jump right into it. William Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon. That's the man there, at least what we think he looked like. We actually really don't know. The portraits we have, we don't know how accurate they are. So he was probably born on April 23rd in the year 1564 in the village of Stratford-upon-Avon in England. I say probably born on that day because back in that time, people didn't keep record of birth, at least in England. Your date of birth wouldn't be recorded, but the day you were baptized would be. So we know he was baptized around April 26th. Usually baptism would happen within that first 3 days of being born. So he was probably born on April 23rd. We also know that he died on April 23rd, 1616. So he probably died on his birthday. That's the kind of gift that I don't want to receive for my birthday. He was a shareholder in the King's Men. He was also their main writer. So back in the Elizabethan days, acting was handled by little companies. You would have a company of actors. You'd have some of those actors be shareholders. They owned part of the company. And you would also have a noble patron. So in that case, they were the King's Men. That's because the King of England, James I at the time, was their patron. So he was the one that kind of put up a lot of money. They were also technically members of his household. For some of the companies that were employed by lesser nobles that maybe had less staff, they could be called upon to serve in that noble's palace or stately home or whatever. So you would have a patron. There were also companies like the Lord Strang's Men, the Lord Admiral's Men. There were a lot of different companies that had different noble patrons, and that would be the name of your company. Shakespeare wrote approximately 41 plays over his time, several of which are lost. We just don't have scripts for them anymore. We have some historical record that they existed and were performed at least once, but the scripts no longer exist. And additionally, Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, none of which we will be covering in this workshop. I find them boring, and as actors, we're not really called upon to do the sonnets very often. So that's something else. That's poetry. Talk to an English teacher about that one. So the first folio, this magnificent book we can see here. The first folio is the collected and printed works of Shakespeare's plays, published in 1623, 7 years after his death. It contains 36 of the officially accepted 38 plays that Shakespeare wrote. There are 235 known surviving copies of the first folio, 82 of which are owned by the Folger Shakespeare Library, and one of which I actually got to see in person. It was really cool. But what's so important about this book is in the Elizabethan and Jacobean era, which was after, but during the time Shakespeare was writing, you never published your scripts. There was no such thing as copyright law. So even as an actor in one of Shakespeare's plays, you would not get the full script. You would just get your lines. You would just be given your lines in like the 4 syllables before your line. And this was done because, again, since there was no copyright, anyone who had access to a script could do it, and like the original author could not go after them for royalties or whatever. They could just do it for free. So that's kind of part of why Shakespeare is so prevalent, is a lot of writers from that time, their works just never got published. So we just don't have their work anymore. There are plenty that were, and I'm not saying Shakespeare is, by any means kind of bad or anything. It just, during that time, a lot of plays have been lost to time because they were never published. And some of Shakespeare's actor friends and colleagues got together and were like, hey, William's works were really good. These need to be preserved for the rest of time. And so they printed these folios. Folio technique is also, first folio is also where we get folio technique, which is what we're going to be talking about for the rest of our time here. Let's keep moving right along. So what is folio technique? You've heard me say this a couple of times now. Folio technique is a technique to approach Shakespeare that was developed by some actors over time based on kind of clues that are left in the text as printed in the first folio. A lot of these are kind of what we might think of as mistakes that were probably intentional, because during Shakespeare's time, they didn't necessarily have much time to prepare to do their plays. They didn't have a lot of rehearsal time because, the sooner you could put up a new play, that's going to bring back your audience sooner. So they might be doing, let's say they're doing Hamlet, and halfway through their run of Hamlet, Shakespeare finishes Romeo and Juliet. You're going to be getting ready to do Romeo and Juliet while you're still performing Hamlet. So you don't have a lot of time. You might have 2 weeks, 3 weeks from the time the script is done to the time you're going to perform it. So Shakespeare left clues for his actors, and that's kind of what folio technique is based around. So the very basis of folio technique is it's all in verse. Shakespeare wrote in both prose and in verse. So the first thing you have to do when you're looking at folio technique is identify which one we're working with. So let's kind of compare them. Prose is going to be any text written without meter. So it's prose it's like how you would normally write. It's not fancy in any way. It's just, I'm writing sentences in a very normal way. Prose is most often used by lower class characters or in informal situations. You see prose a lot more in the comedies. The comedies have a lot of prose. There is prose in the tragedies and the histories, except for King John, I believe it's all verse, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Prose is also easily identified on the page as it extends from margin to margin, unlike verse, which is going to be kind of cut off in the middle there. We will not be talking about prose for the rest of this workshop, because again, that's not really where you find your major clues. So here's a little example of what prose would look like. This is one of my favorite speeches this is the start of one of my favorite speeches from all of Shakespeare. This is Falstaff, who is he's technically a sir, but he is lower class in his mannerisms and dealings. So this would be just read, "'Tis not due yet. I would be loath to pay him before his day. What need I be so forward with a man who calls not on me? As you can see, it's just going to extend from that margin to that other margin. No weird breaks or anything between them. And then we have verse. So verse is any text written in poetic meter. Most commonly when dealing with Shakespeare, it's going to be iambic pentameter. We're going to talk about iambic pentameter in the next slide. So verse is most often used by upper class characters and characters in a heightened emotional state. So verse is kind of what you use either when you are very fancy, very proper, or if you're just feeling your feelings so much that prose doesn't really cut it. Shakespeare's verse is in the form, while Shakespeare's verse is poetry, most cases it is blank verse. So most of the time, the poetry doesn't rhyme. You know, I know poetry we often think of as being rhyming, but Shakespeare's poetry, with exceptions, which we will talk about later, is just going to be blank verse. It's just going to kind of flow that way. Buckle up, folks. We're going to talk about verse a lot in this presentation. And then we have an example of prose here. This is the first line from the first couple of lines from Henry V. So it's, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention." And that's something to also keep in mind with first lines is just because the line ends doesn't mean you should stop. We're going to talk about when you stop at the ends of lines later, but for this, you wouldn't read that as, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention." It would just be, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention." It just flows right into each other, even though there is that kind of unnatural stop. So you've heard me mention a couple of times thus far, iambic pentameter. This is a lot of what I spend time with, at least when I'm doing my folio work. So iambic pentameter is a poetic meter that consists of five mean penta, iambs. An iamb is a foot or a beat consisting of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Most of these lines should have 10 total syllables, all alternating between that unstressed and stressed. It is important, though, to look through all your lines of verse and count out your syllables, because one of Shakespeare's clues is sometimes he would have lines with more syllables, sometimes he would have lines with less syllables. When that happens, that's probably a good signifier that that line is important. So scanning your lines from your syllables can also inform how you're going to say certain words. And we're going to look at that in a couple of these examples. But yeah, Shakespeare, when he wrote in verse, most commonly wrote in iambic pentameter. So it's going to be that da 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 da. That's how it goes. Da 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 da. Unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. And again, there's usually going to be 5 sets of iambs or just 10 syllables total. So let's look at a couple examples over here on the other side. So we have, "Now is the winter of our discontent." Famous opening line from Richard III. And if we look here, we have those different stresses on unstress. "Now is the winter of our discontent." Now is the winter of our discontent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And there we can see how I've split it up into the different sets of, in the different iambs. So that's what we would call a perfect line of verse. It is the exact 10 syllables, the exact 5 iambs with the unstressed, stressed going in that order. Let's look at this next line. "To be or not to be, that is the question." One of the most famous lines in all written works in English ever. To be or not to be, that is the question. Well, I don't know about you, but for me, that sounds a little off, because if we look at it, to be or not to be, that is the question. To be or not to be, that is the question. It's got an extra syllable here. So that tells you, hey, this line is important. You can, what I generally will do if I have a line that is over or under is I will mark like an 11 or however many syllables it is at the end of the line. That way, when I'm just briefly looking at it, I know, hey, that's an important line. This next one, this is from Comedy of Errors. This is a line I said last year in Joliet Drama Guild's production. Let love being light be drowned if she sink. That feels weird, don't it? Let love being light be drowned if she sink. Let love being light be drowned if she sink. Well, that's only 9, but look closely. See how there's that little right above the E in drowned. There's a little accent above that. So that's another clue from Shakespeare. That means drowned becomes drowned. Let love being light be drowned if she sink. So anytime you see that accent above the E, that means that that suffix, or whatever you call it, is separated out from the rest of the word. So that becomes now, let love being light be drowned if she sink. Let love being light be drowned if she sink. And there we have our perfect line of iambic. As we can see there, by separating that out, it helps you there. And also it can help with any word that ends with like a T-I-O-N, like a shun. That could be that can be separated out as well. Like so, action can become actian. So that's just something to look out for if you're having that issue of, hey, this line is short, but I don't think there's anything particularly important in it. Look for that spot where you can carry out that word, or it might be even just a case of in the Elizabethan times they pronounce that word differently. So I'll give you some resources for where you can look where that might be a case. And then, also, sometimes lines of iambic pentameter are split between 2 different characters. So here we have from Romeo and Juliet, Romeo says, "What shall I swear by?" Juliet replies, "Do not swear at all." And that's how you would see it written, how I have it kind of set up here in the example. That's how it would be denoted in your script. Instead of Juliet's line starting over here where Romeo's did, it starts halfway through telling you it is a continuation. So, what shall I swear by? Do not swear at all. As you can see, those lines sync up perfectly, and it becomes one solid line of iambic pentameter. So, and here I've got it marked out as I have with all the others. But generally with iambic pentameter, that's what you spend a lot of time doing, is just da 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 da. If you've been listening, it kind of sounds like a heartbeat, and that's kind of why you can feel when the rhythm is off, because you can feel if your heartbeat got off for a second. So, and again, we don't read lines of iambic pentameter like that. Like if I ever walked into a theater and heard, "Now is the winter of our discontent," I would walk out, and that's the first line of the play. So use that iambic pentameter as a guideline, and once you've done it enough, you'll start to feel the flow. You will feel how that kind of beat is in the back of your your delivery. But again, never da 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 da. Now is the winter of our discontent. It's just no. So let's move right along. Couplets. Couplets are fun. Couplets are a lot of fun. So rhyming couplets are 2 lines of verse that end in a rhyme, one coming right after the other. These can be used for comedic effect, to show a character is in a heightened emotional state, or it might just be purely for emphasis. There are some speeches that are even written completely in couplets. Generally, those are just there to be fun. They're the funny speeches. I've got an example of one. But yeah, couplets are anytime you have 2 lines that rhyme with each other. And again, they're used for if it's supposed to be funny, if it's supposed to be important. And even like someone that's half listening will pick out a couplet. And let's just look at the example. So this is from King Lear. I know it's odd to have a funny speech from one of these sad plays, but this is the Fool. And also, before we go into it, I will point out this speech is not in perfect iambic. It's actually far from it. It's a weird speech. I think it's kind of all over the place. But after those first two lines, look what happens. When priests are more in word than matter, when brewers mar their malt with water. That's a couplet. When nobles are their tailors' tutors, no heretics burned, but wenches' suitors. Couplet. All the rest of the lines until the last one are all sets of couplets. But we can look down here towards the bottom. Then shall the realm of Albion come to great confusion. Well, that doesn't rhyme. But remember what I said earlier about being able to separate out that shun at the end. So instead of being then shall the realm of Albion come to great confusion, it becomes not then shall the realm of Albion come to great confusion. Albion and confusion, that rhymes a little bit better. So you can use if you feel like something, hey, this probably a couplet, this could be a rhyme if it were just a little different. You can use that as a tool to know, hey, this is supposed to be pronounced differently, or you can even make a joke out of it. For those of you planning on auditioning for our upcoming production of As You Like It, there's a great one of those moments in As You Like It. There's a great scene where they're reading letters that are supposed to be little poems. But yeah, couplets are just something that's fun, and it's another one of those signposts like, hey, this is important, whether it's just because it's a joke or because the content itself is important. Okay, next we have punctuation, why it's important. I mean, punctuation is always important, but in Shakespeare, it gives us some extra clues. So, punctuation is always important, but Shakespeare uses punctuation to inform us how to speak the speech. Punctuation found within a line is observed as normal. It's when it falls at the end of a line that we are particularly concerned with in this presentation. So what I mean by that, a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point, those all denote a full stop. It's the end of your main thought. It's when you're going to take just a full moment. Let what you just said sink in. And again, this is only when it comes at the end of a line. Everything we're talking about here on this slide now is at the end of lines. So a period, exclamation mark, or question mark, all full stops. Then we have the colon or semicolon. These are going to denote a half stop. It's ending your current thought, but it's going to connect right away into that next related thought. I keep saying full stop, half stop. Punctuation in Shakespeare is a lot like reading music, and your punctuation marks, those are going to be your rests. So when these punctuation come at the end of a line, like a period is a full rest, colon's going to be a half rest, and then we'll get into comma is going to be your quarter rest. But yeah, so when you say that colon, you're ending one thought, but you have another thought that's going to be related to it right away. And then, of course, we've got commas. That's just a quick stop. It's continuing your current thought, but you've got something else you need to say that's a little bit different. So with all of these, again, it's punctuation only at the end of the line. Punctuation found within a line should be read normally, and influence like pauses and breathing. Let's go right ahead, take a look at some examples. So this is the part of the prologue to Romeo and Juliet. As you can see, we've got a lot of different punctuation at the end of the line. So let's just start right at the top. Two households, both alike in dignity, comma. So we're just going to take that brief pause because we're not done talking about these two households. We're just going to now move on to in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. We're talking about where they are. So those first couple, those are all those commas. Those are going to be those brief pauses. So you might read it, two households, both alike in dignity. In fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. See, now we've hit that period there at the end of unclean. That's a full stop. That is, I'm going to pause right now. There's going to be a little silence in there as I let it settle in. So you might read that. Where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their lives. When misadventure piteous overthrows. So, oh, my bad. So again, just use that over here on the left as a guide for what you see on your right side there. And remember, period is a full stop, end of thought, you're done. Gonna move on to the next thing. A colon or semicolon, you're done talking about what you're talking about now, but you have something that's directly related that you're going to talk about next. It's that half stop, and a comma is going to be a brief stop. And very often commas, if you see a lot of commas in a row, those commas build. We're going to talk about lists later, and lists also build and build and build. So you're going to take that brief pause, but you're going to come back with even more energy to just keep punching through though. You got to punch through your commas. So next slide. Oh, this is one of my favorites, the ekphonesis O. Ekphonesis O. So this is a sound that comes from the Greek theater. It is a cry of passion. If you're reading Shakespeare and you see O spelled O-H, that means that Shakespeare wanted you to say O. But if you just see a big old O, it's a big old circle in the middle of your line, that is an ekphonesis O. And Shakespeare is looking for the actor to cry out in passion. So I like that cry out in passion. It is a big sound. It is again, Greek theater is a cry of passion. So ekphonesis O doesn't have to be, and frankly shouldn't just be an O. It can be any sound you want it to be that really fits that moment. It is what you do when words, like your emotions are just so high, words don't suffice anymore. You just need to make a sound, big sound. So let's look at some examples of where you might see the ekphonesis O. This is from Romeo and Juliet. Big emotions in that show. Unwieldy, slow, heavy, as pale as lead. Ah, God, she comes. Oh, honey, nurse. It can be any sound you want, and it's also going to help you fill your iambic pentameter line. We've got other examples here. Here is one from the Scottish play, I'm pretty sure, from the outdam spot line or speech from the Lady of the Castle. Here's the smell of blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this hand. Oh, oh. It can be any sound you feel like throwing in there. Obviously, like I maybe got a little silly there with that last one. Make it appropriate, but again, it's when words fail. That's when you have your ekphonesis O. So we covered a lot of that. Now we're just going to talk about some clues that Billy left. So again, actors in Shakespeare's day didn't have much time to rehearse. As such, Shakespeare left a couple clues in his text for the actors to know what's really important. So all of these are going to be different things in the text that most people would probably just look at as mistakes, but a lot of Shakespeare scholars and actors see them as clues. And now it is important, especially with this part of it, to know you're only going to see these clues if you are actually reading off of a folio copy of the text. A lot of the Shakespeare, like you could go down to Barnes and Noble today and pick up a copy of any play. it's not going to have these clues in them because modern publishers have kind of cleaned it up, as it were. So they've gotten rid of a lot of the weird capitalizations, the misspellings, that kind of stuff. So this slide especially, these are going to be things that you only see if you're reading off of a folio transliteration. So you got to look for that kind of folio. It'll say on it, I'll give you a web page later where you can see all of them, but you need to make sure it's a folio copy. So capitalized words that don't need to be capitalized. If it's capitalized and it shouldn't be, that's important. Next one, words that are misspelled. So this one is actually kind of iffy because in Shakespeare's time, the English language had not been standardized. There was no one right way to spell any given word. Even Shakespeare's name, there are several different spellings you can find in historical records. So what you can do if you say, hey, this word looks like it's misspelled, look for other instances of that word in either the play you're working with at the time or other texts. If it's spelled differently there, then that's a misspelling. Where if it's just like I'm adding an E at the end of this, that may or may not be. So misspellings are kind of one that you have to do a little bit of extra research to know if it's a misspelling on purpose or if it's just because we didn't have a standardized language at the time. Next, we have repetition of words, phrases, or ideas. So I talked about lists earlier. Lists are repetition. I've got a really great example of that in the example that I'm going to pull up on the other side here in a moment. But just like with normal speech like today, if something's repeated, that's important. Also, if you look at the last line or the last word of each line of a speech, it's often going to serve as a general guidepost for kind of the overall themes of that speech. And we'll look at an example of that in a moment. So let's take a look at this example on the right side here. This is the opening speech from Richard III. Let's just look at it line by line. So, now is the winter of our discontent. Well, right there in the first line, we have two of them, winter and discontent. Those words have no good reason to be capitalized. So we know that if we're speaking the speech, we have to really hit those words. Those are important. So now is the winter of our discontent. In the next line, summer, also don't have a good reason for that to be capitalized. Sun is also shouldn't be capitalized. Now York here at the end of the line, York should be because it's a family name, it's a title, or it's a last name, but E at the end, that probably wouldn't be there. They'd probably know, they would probably spell York without the E. So since there is that E at the end, that's important. In the third line, okay, so this word here, vipon, that's not vipon, that's upon. Printers at the time didn't have a ton of letters for their printing press. So if you see a V where a U would make sense, it's just supposed to be a U. It's it's just a case of printing at the time. But in the next line, deep and bosom have that E at the end. So you have to make that distinction. Is this just how they would have spelled it at the time, or is it something important? Ocean, capitalized. So those are those capitalizations and misspellings. Let's move down here to this section here. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarms changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delight. It's that repetition. We're saying our. So that's telling you that this section is important, and also it's going to build. Your lists always build. So we see it again down here. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking lass, I, that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph. It's I. It is that list, it is building, it is repeating, it is building. And then we also look at the last line of each, the last word of each line. Discontent, York House, buried reeds, monuments, meetings. It's kind of going over Richard's kind of thesis for the speeches. This is how things were. I don't like it. I'm going to make things the way I want them to be. So again, take all of those ideas and use them to find the clues. Because there's a lot of stuff, especially in a speech like this, there's a lot of stuff in there that you might not otherwise hit with like modern sensibilities. And then we've got just some other considerations, things that aren't exactly considered folio technique, but are important to keep in mind when working with Shakespeare. Our first one's going to be word choice. Shakespeare was very careful with his word choice, so much so that if the right word didn't exist for what he wanted to convey, he would make up a new one. Also, some words we think of as similar may have differences in historical context, kind of like you versus thou. You was a very formal word back then. Thou you would use in informal situations or talking to someone below you in status. When you're in doubt, check a glossary. I'm going to give you a resource at the end that is a great glossary, one that I use personally. And I know a lot of other Shakespearean actors that also use quite a bit. When in doubt, just look it up. And also, if you don't have that resource at the time, you can use your context clues to get some of that context. And, kind of look at it. Speaking of context, we have historical context. It is helpful to remember that while Shakespeare's plays are timeless, they were written well over 400 years ago, and they were written for the everyday man. So as such, because they were written for commoners, and just the average person of the time, there's going to be a lot of references to things that were going on at the time that we might not know about and may not be important to us, but it can help color your performances. Ultimately, how you use the history, it's going to vary in your performance. It's going to vary from production to production. Talk to your director. So here are some resources. I'm going to make this slideshow available for solitary viewing later, but you can also write down these websites. These are just some great websites for anything Shakespeare. So that first one is Internet Shakespeare at uvic.ca. That's going to have all the copies of all the plays in the original folio text, as well as having facsimiles of the actual folio book itself. So if you wanted to see like what that page actually looked like in that book from the 1600s, you can do that on that webpage, but it's also got it in just plain typed out text. This next one, some people might see as controversial, but Spark Notes and their No Fear Shakespeare line. No Fear Shakespeare is great. It's got it set up so they do all the different plays, but it has the original text on one side, and then in a column next to it, it's a modern translation of the play. So if you've got a section of text that no matter how many times you read it, you just cannot crack it, you just do not know what the character is saying, go to the No Fear. There's no shame in it. Just go to the No Fear, look at the translation, and it will help you. It will help you kind of connect the original text to the modern sensibility. Also, there's essays on like the themes and the characters in those books that if you're just in the weeds, it can really be helpful. So I know a lot of people look down on Spark Notes, but no. The No Fear Shakespeare line is a great resource. This third one is probably one of my favorites. It's shakespeareswords.com. There's also a Shakespeare's Word book. But this is that, it's a glossary. So it's a glossary. All the words that Shakespeare ever used are in this book. So it's going to have definitions, pronunciation guides, context, all of that kind of stuff. It's in Shakespeare's words. So if you have a word that you have no idea what it means, go to Shakespeare's Words. You can just look it up. It's going to be there. And I believe they also have like every time it's used in all the different plays. Oh, excuse me. And then this last one, it's a resource that's only going to be for my actors. ShakespeareMonologues.org. It has all of the speeches from all of the different Shakespeare plays. So this is a great resource for audition monologues, or if you just want to look at some speeches, it's at least a good place to start. What I generally do when I'm using it is I will go in there, look for a speech that's got some kind of gives me a mood for the character, for what they're feeling at that moment. Then I will go into the text and read that scene, read up to that point in the play, just to get the full context. And then if you want to do your folio work, you have to go pull it up in one of the other ones like that Internet Shakespeare UBIC. Because on that page, they don't have it they don't have the folio version. There are infinite amount of Shakespeare resources out there. These are just a few that I personally use, and that are good for when you're just kind of starting out. I've got a blank slide. No, I don't. We have one last piece of advice. This is the biggest piece of advice I can give for someone that wants to work with Shakespeare or has thought about Shakespeare but just doesn't know what to do with it. So if you take away one thing from this workshop, this is what I hope it would be. Remember, it's only a play. If you put Shakespeare on a pedestal, that is a disservice to what these writings really are. They're entertainment. It is something that I've seen over and over again with people that are kind of put off by Shakespeare. If you think of Shakespeare as this high and mighty thing that is so hard to access, that is how it is going to be for you to, like, for every aspect of your approach to the text. Whereas if you think about this as just any other play by any other writer, just with maybe a little bit of funny language, it's going to be so much easier to connect. Part of why Shakespeare is so pervasive in a modern context, why he is kind of, continued on to this very day, at least in my opinion, it's because he wrote great stories and he wrote great characters that even 400 years later, we can still connect with. So again, just use the tools I've given you to break down the language, and then just find how you as an actor connect with these characters so we can bring these phenomenal stories to our audiences. So yeah, just remember, it's only a play. That is all I've got for you. So I want to thank you all for joining me for this little workshop. If you are seeing this not long after it is released, I hope to see you for our upcoming auditions. I work with Joliet Drama Guild. Let's see here. Let's stop the share and I'll just talk to you myself for a moment. Sorry, I have to look at this. But yeah, if you're seeing this just after it was put up, I hope you join us. We're having auditions for As You Like It, which is a really phenomenal comedy. If you're seeing this years and years later, hi, welcome. I hope the future is going as well as the past is, or better. But I hope you've found some value in what I've had to say today. Again, there are so many Shakespeare resources out there that I hope you've taken something away from this little workshop and we can continue the love of Shakespeare in the world. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.